everyone, and welcome to The Ridge. And to those of you joining us online, welcome. Thanks for being a part of service today. My name is John, and I'm one of the pastors on staff here at The Ridge, but I don't actually live in Wisconsin. Last summer, my wonderful wife, Serena, she got matched into residency as a physician in Seattle, Washington. And so that's us at her graduation. And if you're not familiar with the difference between Wisconsin and Washington, let me describe it to you like this. We traded our snow shovels for raincoats. Yeah. And maybe you're expecting an umbrella, but the thing about Seattleites is they don't use umbrellas. They have this magical pride that protects them when they walk in their raincoats in the rain. And so if you see somebody using an umbrella in Seattle, it means that they're a tourist. Yeah. But so now we moved out there last summer, but I actually, like I said, I stayed on staff. And so I serve with our communications team, and then I also host the Ridge podcast. And so I get to interview some really amazing people and connect with them and gain a lot of wisdom like that. And so if you haven't heard that podcast yet, I'd encourage you to just check it out. But I want to start today and just share who I think will really benefit from the message today. And so if you came in this morning to the Ridge or today to the Ridge and you had an argument with your significant other or somebody you're coming in with, well, then today's message is for you. If you have a text on your phone that you haven't replied to yet, well, then today's message might be for you. If you saw a political post on Facebook yesterday and you just couldn't quite resist getting into the discussion, well, then today's message is for you. And if you think maybe in the back of your mind or you're really vocal about it, that this guy who lived 2,000 years ago named Jesus has absolutely nothing to offer your life today, well, then today's message is for you. In fact, the last 6 weeks have actually been for you because we've been talking in this series about this famous speech that Jesus gave called the Sermon on the Mount. And in it, he gives us 8 statements that, if we live them out, really help us live the happiest, most fulfilled life here and now. And so that's why we named the series Here and Now, because when we apply these things, we get a chance to live out our most blessed, fulfilled life. Now, if you notice this theme amongst all the different people that this message is for, it's for those of us that are currently experiencing a conflict in our life. And that's because the statement that we're going to look at from Jesus is one that gives us some wisdom on how we can have peace in the conflict in our life. And it's some wisdom that we really need, because if we're honest with ourselves, most of us are really bad at conflict. Like this weekend was supposed to be opening weekend for baseball. And I was really excited. I was going to fly in. I was going to catch a game at Miller Park. And yes, I know it's AmFam now, but let's be real. It's Miller Park, right? Yeah. But I can't because the Players Association and the owners, they were fighting and they couldn't resolve their conflict well enough and soon enough, and so the season's been delayed. And all of us across the world are feeling the impact on the war in Ukraine. I know, honestly, when I was sitting down to write this message, I was having a challenging time because I just felt inadequate to talk about peace amongst personal conflict when there's this horrible, heartbreaking situation that's happening. But the reality is that now is the time that we have to have this conversation, this message more than ever. Because conflicts that are big and huge, they may seem nuanced and incredibly complicated, and that's fair, but they all start on this person-to-person conflict level, where one person says one thing to the other, and then that conflict doesn't get resolved, and it grows and grows and grows over time, and just gets bigger and bigger, and more people become impacted by it. And so why do we have such a challenging time resolving the conflict in our lives? Why do we have such a challenging time? I think that at its core, it's because every conflict has a cost to resolve it. This is what I mean. In an argument, somebody has to be the one to say, I'm sorry, or I was wrong. In a labor dispute, one side has to admit that, this is the best that we're going to get. We're not going to get any better of a deal. In a war, one side has to surrender something that they really want in order to have peace. In relationships, you might have to suck up your pride or, go to that restaurant that the other person wants to go to. But the bigger the conflict, typically, the bigger the cost is to resolve it. And if we're honest, none of us really like to be the ones to pay that cost. I know that I sure don't. When I'm arguing with a family member, I don't want to say I'm sorry. I want to be right. And then when you're having that argument and that conflict, and when I'm having that, and neither side wants to resolve it, it just grows and grows and grows and gets bigger because neither party is willing to pay that price of peace. But we're okay with the other person paying for that peace. And so that kind of gives us a little bit of a clue as to how we can resolve our conflict issue. See, and how we can notice what our conflict issue really is. Because if we want peace with the other person, but we continue to have conflict, it must be how we are trying to get peace. And so we see that our problem is that most of us are trying to be peacekeepers. And at first that sounds really good, right? Like a peacekeeper, that sounds nice. But the thing about a peacekeeper is that their main concern is protecting our peace, not the other person's. And so I would define a peacekeeper like this. A peacekeeper makes the other person pay the price of peace. And there are three main ways that this kind of shows itself. And as you see it, we're going to see that not only does this peacekeeping not work, it really doesn't give us the peace that we think it would. That's the irony of the whole thing. So the first way that we might show ourselves as peacekeepers is we avoid. And once again, this sounds like it's not that bad of a thing, right? But when I was 4 years old and I spilled barbecue sauce on our dining room wicker chairs, and then I used a pillow to cover it up, I learned that avoiding an issue does not make it go away. In fact, it just makes somebody else have to pay for it. And in a relationship, I mean, that's one way that they might pay relationally for that conflict. For example, like if you start to avoid a conflict in your life, it may make you start to have this bitterness and resentment towards the other person, and that relationally creates a distance between you. They're paying that price. That price might look more tangible. Like if you have a coworker that you really need to tell in a loving and appropriate way that they're too abrasive, well, if you don't tell them that, then they may lose clients and friends because no one is willing to have that conversation with them to help them get through that challenging thing because we're avoiding that conflict. This is actually something that I feel directly working remotely. As you can imagine, working remotely involves a lot of video calls and video conferences, and we recently made this switch to Microsoft Teams. And the thing about Microsoft Teams is that the quality is terrible. The video quality is bad. The audio quality is like hot garbage. It is just brutal. If I ever have to join another Microsoft Teams call again, it'll be too soon. I'm sorry if some of you work for Microsoft. But nobody said anything for a long time. And so the conflict didn't get resolved, and everybody paid the price for it. We're back on Zoom, which is great. So we avoid. We also fight. Now, for me, this is how I learned to handle conflict growing up. I have 3 brothers, which means that there was 4 boys running around the house, which means we fought over anything and everything, whether it was leftovers, whether it was shotgun for the car, whether it was playing Nintendo 64, whatever it was, we fought. And then my role models, the people that I would look up to, they would win every argument or fight or discussion that they ever had. And so for me, what I learned was to resolve a conflict meant to get my peace back by winning. And so I would try as hard as I could to win every discussion, every argument, debate. Sometimes that's with an argument, sometimes that's just trying to be extra logical or whatever it was. And the thing about winning is you are trying to make the other person lose. And so how did those conflicts work out for me? Not well. And that's why I think that this conversation is so important. Because if we can figure this out, then we have a better chance of being able to have that peace in our lives because the conflict things that we're trying aren't working. I know they haven't for me. Now, the third way that we might be peacekeepers is we cancel. And we're seeing this one a lot lately. And the instant reaction is to think of this politically. But I want to challenge you to think about this more in terms of removing somebody's voice from your life. This is different from avoiding. This is saying that because this person has a different perspective or viewpoint than mine, I'm going to remove them from my life and being able to speak to me. And so I see lots of social media posts, and I'm sure you have too, that say something like, hey, if you don't agree, unfriend me. Now I just want to make a quick caveat that this doesn't involve the safety issue. And so if somebody in your life is causing you harm and giving them access to you is causing you more harm, that's a separate issue. This is really about removing other people's viewpoints from your life. So these are the three different ways that we might be peacekeepers. I'm sure some of these are probably going to sound familiar. And these sound at first glance like modern solutions to peace, but they're not. These are how people have really resolved conflict forever. In fact, if we look at Jesus' time, all right, the Jewish people and Samaritans, they had this history of geopolitical conflict. And so the Jewish people, their response to the conflict is they would just avoid the territory of Samaria. And so they would walk around it instead of going the quicker route through it. It's actually what made a lot of the things that Jesus did so wild, is because he was willing to interact with them. The Jewish people and the Romans had conflict that had resulted in the Jewish people revolting from Rome, both before and after Jesus' time. And so their response was to fight, and it did not work for them well. And then the people who had direct conflict with Jesus themselves, the Pharisees, their response was to cancel him by crucifying him. And these solutions, these ways of being a peacekeeper to get peace, they didn't work then, and they don't work now. But thankfully, there's a better way, and it's the way that Jesus gives us. And so, let's look at what better way Jesus gives us. This is what he tells us. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. So Jesus says, don't be a peacekeeper, be a peacemaker. And at first, these things sound very similar, but I promise this is not just semantics. This is a completely different way of handling conflict resolution in our lives. And so if we look at the example of Jesus and the ways that he achieved peace, we're going to see we're going to find out how we can be peacemakers. And the first thing that we're going to learn, overall arching it, is this: that peace with God equips us for peace with others. And so we're going to look at the way that Jesus created peace and his example of how he made that peace in a challenging situation, and it's going to illustrate for us how to be peacemakers. All right, so the Apostle Paul was a close follower of Jesus, and after Jesus' death, he writes this statement to a diverse group of Christians. This is what he says. For he himself, it's Jesus, is our peace, who has made the two groups one, and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. So these two groups that Paul is talking about had this tremendous animosity for one another. I mean, one group would think of the other and with this disgust and disdain, would refer to them as dogs. One group if the other group walked into their house, they would burn their house to the ground. That's the level of animosity. These two groups were Jews and Gentiles. And culturally, we don't have the same reaction to those two groups that they would have then. And so if you will, picture this in your mind, all right? You're in a room, and the most vocal Democrat that you know is in that room with you, and the most vocal Republican is in that room with you, and they're talking about politics. Can you just feel the tension already? That is nothing compared to how Jews and Gentiles would have interacted with one another and how they would have felt towards each other. Why? Well, the Jewish people had this set of religious laws that they would follow, and it would be how they would establish their relationship with God. It's how they mitigated this cost that would happen whenever somebody created a conflict between themselves and God. And it was designed; these laws were designed to set themselves apart in such a way that they would be an example to the whole world, to other people, of why it was a positive thing to have a relationship with God. And a part of that was being ceremonially clean. And so behaviors and actions that Gentiles took would make them unclean. And so when they interacted with one another, then Jews would have to do ceremonial cleaning. And so as you can imagine, that would be uncomfortable, inconvenient. There's probably all sorts of judgment and disgust that's happening that just over time builds up. And that's on the Jewish people's side. And for Gentiles, imagine this. You give me a hug, and then I tell you, well, now I got to go take a shower. What is your reaction towards me? It's not going to be positive. And so there's this major conflict between these two groups. And to make it more challenging, if we talked about every conflict has a cost to resolve it, well, a simple "I'm sorry," a humble conversation, it's not going to resolve this conflict. It's a foundational religious law problem. And so nobody can pay that cost. And that's where Jesus comes in. And as we see what Jesus did, Jesus destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. And he does this by setting aside in his flesh the law with its commands and regulations. And so when Jesus dies, when Jesus willingly gives up his life, he pays the price between every person that has conflict with him and others. He pays the price for that peace. And so now there's no longer this need for this religious law that has created this barrier. And so both groups can interact with one another and have peace. So his actions here, when Jesus does this, they show us what it actually means to be a peacemaker. To be a peacemaker is to be the one to pay the price of peace. If you're like me, this idea doesn't settle with you too well. Because there's this natural gut reaction of, why do I have to be the one? That's not fair. Why do I have to be the one to pay the price of peace? Well, Jesus already paid the price for us. Whenever we sin, whenever we do something that creates conflict between ourselves and God, well, that price has already been paid by Jesus to wipe that cost away. And maybe you're feeling like, hey, what if I try to create peace with them? What if I pay that price, but they don't even accept it? Well, personally, the humbling, eye-opening thing for me is when I think about the fact that 7 out of 10 people in the world have told Jesus no. 5 billion people just today have said no to the price that Jesus already paid. And that's why this idea, there's this foundational idea that peace with God equips us. If we can go to the next, yeah, there we go. There's this foundational idea that peace with God equips us for peace with others. Because it's when we reflect on our peace with God, when we allow that, when we think about that, and we say, this price has already been paid for us, that's when we're allowed to, we feel like, and we feel empowered and the freedom to extend it to other people. Now, for those of you, maybe you don't have peace with God. You don't have a relationship with God. I want to come back to you in a little bit. But for those of us who do have a relationship with God, it's our job to look to the example of Jesus and reflect that to others. Yes, our relationship with Jesus means that we get heaven, but it also means that we have the opportunity to create a picture of heaven on earth. And so that's when we reflect on what Jesus has done for us. We reflect on the example he's done, and we can extend that to others. This is not a shame or a guilt type of thing. This is I've already been covered, I've already been taken care of, and so I can extend this to other people. I like to think of it like you're on a plane and the oxygen masks, they drop down in front of you, but you've already got your personal supply of O2 ready to go, and so you can just jump into action and start extending this to other people. So, but how do we do this? How do we extend this peacemaking? How do we become a peacemaker with others? Well, Jesus is going to give us a little bit of help in terms of creating a willingness for ourselves. So this is what Jesus says later on in his Sermon on the Mount when he's talking about people that are angry with one another. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, so the altar was this place that they would travel miles and miles and miles to go to in order to make this sacrifice or gift to God to really essentially pay the price of peace between themselves and God. And so Jesus says, hey, you're offering your gift at the altar, but then you remember that your brother or sister has something against you. And so Jesus is setting the stage and says, hey, you've traveled all this way to make things right with me, but then you remember somebody's got something against you. And this carries with it the implication that you have a part of the source of the conflict. And if we're honest with ourselves, just about every conflict that we interact with, at least some part of it we can take ownership for, and some part of it we can claim. So you do this, then you leave your gift there in front of the altar, and first go and be reconciled to them. And then you come and offer your gift. Do you want to know one of the most annoying things in the world is? Is when you get up in the morning, you get ready for work, and you drive in, you hit construction traffic, so it takes extra long to get into work, and you sit down in the office, you open up your bag, and your laptop's not there. And you die a little bit on the inside because gas is $4 a gallon, and so now you have to drive all the way back to your house to get your laptop. And the reason why you do that is because the most important thing to get your work done is your laptop. It's not your office. Without your laptop, you can't do anything else. And it's just like that story Jesus illustrates with this story. He illustrates that the most important thing for you to do is to be a peacemaker, despite the inconvenience that it may cause. It's so important to be a peacemaker. We are to be the instigators of peace, not avoid, fight, or cancel. Now, the go and be reconciled gives us a little bit of an example of, hey, how can we actually do this practically? So here are 3 practical ways to set yourself up to be a good peacemaker. The first, go humbly. This really is a heart thing that sets the stage for everything else. Because if we don't do this well, it makes any other thing that we try to do to have peace significantly more challenging. And so a part of being and going humbly is that we have to remember that we are the ones to pay the price of being the price of peace. And so that means that lines that redirect the blame towards the other person, like, hey, I'm sorry that you get so easily offended. Hey, I was just responding to what you did to me. Those don't help. Those just make the problem worse. I know for me, I have to ask myself the question, hey, who am I thinking about in this situation? Because for me, I have this tendency to think that, hey, if I can just get them to understand my thinking, then the conflict will be resolved. But it doesn't work that way. Instead, as peacemakers, we need to focus on trying to understand the other person instead of trying to be understood. So that's the first way we can be a peacemaker, is we go humbly. The second way we do it is we go quickly. So take your chance to maybe emotionally calm down and get yourself in a little bit of a better place there, but then we go quickly. For me, I have this temptation to have an imaginary conversation with the other person the longer the time goes by. I'm going to say this, they're going to say that, I'm going to hit him with this zinger, it's going to be really great. And all that really does is it builds up this bitterness for myself and makes me more convinced of how right I am. So instead, I need to not play mind games with the other person and play these head games and go to them quickly and start initiating that peace. The third thing is go directly. If somebody is not a part of the solution, they don't need to know about the issue. And this can be really a really challenging thing for us to have happen, especially at work, where maybe somebody else might have, if they don't have the full story, it might affect their opinion of you. But talking behind people's backs also is going to affect their opinion of you. And so we go directly to the person that we have conflict with. For me, going directly, I have always felt this tension of, my response to going directly was, I'm going to go, and I'm going to go ready to fight. And I'm going to go ready to fight, and I'll just convince them of how right I am. And that is what I always thought going directly meant. But do you know how the biggest, most challenging conflicts in my life have been resolved? I'll say it this way. I have never argued my way into peace, but I have apologized my way into it. And it takes thinking and trying to understand the other person and being willing to say, I'm sorry. And you'd be amazed by the peace and the impact that can create. I know I have been. So we go humbly, quickly, and directly. And the great thing about this is we haven't even talked about why peacemakers are so blessed. So let's look at what Jesus said. He said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." So Jesus says, hey, not only when you're a peacemaker is God looking at you like a dad looks at his kid taking his first steps, but You are a child of God. You are a representation of what it means to follow Jesus to everybody else. Because a child of God brings people together in unity, not in division. The term Christian has gotten a pretty bad rap lately. But what if every time somebody thought of a Christian, they thought of somebody who was willing to make every effort to make peace with other people? That is what God calls us to be the peacemakers, to instigate the peace with others. And we have the freedom to do that because of what he's already done for us, because of the peace that he's already given us. We said earlier that peace with God equips us for peace with others, but maybe as you're sitting here right now, you're thinking, I don't have peace with God, but you'd like to. I just want to invite you to say a prayer with me, to talk to God with me. And the words that I'm going to say, I hope that you would just repeat them in your mind and your heart as I pray them. And they're not a magic formula, because a relationship with Jesus isn't a transaction, it's a relationship. It's just a really good way of articulating, hey, I want to make this decision to accept the peace that Jesus has offered me. So would you please pray with me? Jesus, thank you for being willing to pay the price for peace. I'm sorry that I have done things that have created conflict between myself and you, and myself and others. And today, I just want to vocalize a decision to follow you. I want to make a decision to accept the peace that you've given me, the peace that you gave me when you died on that cross. I make that decision today. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Well, if you just made that decision, I'm so excited for you. I'm so excited for that decision. And I want to let you know that you're not alone. You're not alone in making that decision, and you're not alone on this journey of following Jesus. And so I want to encourage you, text Jesus to this number. If you're listening on the podcast, then you can just find the number in the show notes. But text that number. We'll send you back some stuff the way that you can connect and get some more information on what's next and follow Jesus. But to everyone, thank you so much for coming to service today, and have an amazing and a wonderful week.